It's the most powerful military alliance in human history versus, well, Russia and China. Who would win an ultimate showdown between the liberal democracies of the West and the autocratic societies of the East? As Russia is increasingly isolated in the world stage and its situation in Ukraine becomes more and more difficult, Russia has turned more to China. The two nations have shared an uneasy relationship through the 20th and 21st century, being more frenemies than close partners. Despite this, though, China and Russia both are finding themselves forced into an alliance of convenience of sorts as the world increasingly turns away from both authoritarian powers to embrace the liberal values of democracy. NATO needs no introduction. Established in the wake of World War II to ensure such a conflict never happened again, its resolve was immediately put to the test by the Soviet Union and its counterpart, the Warsaw Pact. Inevitably, though, NATO came out on top as the Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight and the desire for many of its client states and republics to adopt Western values. Today, NATO stands unchallenged and unrivaled, the greatest military power on the planet bar none. First, we have to talk about experience, because having all the fancy kit doesn't matter if you've never had to use it while someone was trying to kill you. Russia is an experienced power with multiple smaller modern wars under its belt. Almost from the end of the Soviet Union, the new Russian Federation was tested with a separatist movement in Chechnya, prompting two brutal wars that saw most of the republic leveled by superior Russian firepower. It also invaded Georgia to strip off part of its territory for its own. Russia would then go on to support the Assad regime in the modern age and be instrumental in preventing its downfall to US-backed and pro-democracy rebels. A closer inspection of the Russian record, though, is worth scrutinizing. In Chechnya, Russia may have prevented the republic from becoming independent, but it would be very difficult to claim it had truly achieved its objectives there. Russia, the far superior power by a long shot, ran into numerous and staggering difficulties in subjugating the small republic. The conflict highlighted a complete lack of experience in urban warfare, with Russian tanks and armored vehicles decimated in huge numbers by rebel forces armed with RPGs and anti-tank mines. Russia inevitably fell back to doing what it's good at, leveling everything in sight. Using staggering numbers of artillery, Russia achieved victory through indiscriminate destruction, resulting in huge civilian casualties. Its forces would fare better in Georgia, where they fought a more organized and less asymmetrical enemy, though one very poorly equipped and easily overwhelmed by Russian and Allied forces. In Syria, Russian deficiencies were once more on display as it was forced to rely on indiscriminate violence to achieve its objectives. Famously, Russian aircraft and artillery bombarded Aleppo in a month-long campaign, targeting medical facilities and residential buildings alike. This terror doctrine is a signature of the Russian warfighting playbook. Unable to conduct efficient urban operations when faced with a stubborn and well-defended foe in an urban area, Russia inevitably relies on indiscriminate bombing and shelling with no regard to civilian loss of life. In fact, the killing of civilians is the entire point of Russian doctrine in a bid to break the fighting spirit and the will of the defenders. At the start of the Ukraine war, Russia attempted modern combined arms warfare and a shock and awe campaign in the style of the Americans. However, Russia severely overestimated its own capabilities, and its bid to take the Ukrainian capital in 3 days with a lightning assault failed terribly, leading to one of the most embarrassing withdrawals in modern Russian history. Now the Ukrainian war drags on in the style that Russia is best suited for: slow, attritional warfare, punctuated with the deliberate targeting of civilians and their infrastructure in a bid to break the Ukrainian people's will to resist. In terms of strengths, despite an estimated 100,000+ casualties in Ukraine, Russia is still able to field a significantly large army, albeit one increasingly manned by poorly trained and poorly motivated conscripts. This is a significant problem if Russia were to move on from the Ukrainian war into a full-blown confrontation with NATO, even with the help of China as an ally. However, Russia is well suited to attritional warfare with an artillery corps that, despite losses in Ukraine, is still significantly huge. Before the war, Russia fielded approximately 6,500 self-propelled guns, 7,500 towed guns, and 3,391 multiple-launch rocket systems. In terms of raw firepower, there's no greater artillery force on Earth. Russia's second greatest strength is the will of its people to bear incredible costs and continue fighting. Despite becoming a pariah nation, or perhaps even because of it, and exponentially greater losses than predicted, Russians still show a huge amount of support for the disastrous war in Ukraine. This would be critical, as a war with NATO would force Russia to mount a true national mobilization campaign, bringing as many as 46 million into uniform over the course of a long multi-year war. Actually being able to feed and equip all those troops, though, remains an incredibly dubious proposition. China has no modern military experience to speak of other than anti-piracy operations. Its last conflict was in the 1970s against a Vietnam already weakened by years of fighting the US-led South Vietnamese forces. Despite this, the Vietnamese were able to fight China to a standstill and then force them to retreat, achieving none of their operational objectives. Prior to this, China and the US faced off together during the Korean War, when Chinese planes went up against American fighters. Even with the help of Russian pilots secretly flying for the Chinese fighters were decimated by the American and UN forces. However, on the ground, the massive influx of massive numbers of Chinese infantry forced the American-led UN force to retreat, albeit at catastrophic cost to the Chinese themselves. The Chinese military of today is a modern force capable of power projection in its immediate region, but with little ability to wage a modern conflict far from its own shores. Indeed, many question the ability for China to invade and occupy Taiwan successfully. The small island nation it considers a rebel republic and sitting just 90 miles off its own shores. China's biggest weaknesses are its logistics and lack of experience with modern combined arms warfare. While Chinese authors expound the need to wage an all-domain war, China has no experience doing so against a capable and determined adversary, nor of waging any major military campaign even in an exercise situation lasting for more than a few days. Despite this, though, any adversary going to war against China should expect heavy losses and anything but a quick and easy victory. NATO's own experience is vastly superior to both of its would-be adversaries. In 1995, the alliance faced its first military intervention in Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, many of the member states took part in the stunningly successful US-led war against Iraq in 1991. Here, NATO faced a large and well-equipped military with a dense air defense system modeled after the Soviets and a very capable air force. Despite this, the coalition dismantled Iraq's defenses in a matter of weeks at little cost to itself, prompting both Moscow and Beijing to immediately begin rethinking their own military doctrines. Its ill-fated adventurism in Iraq would lead to massive regional disruption that threw the Middle East into chaos, while its attempt to replace the Taliban government in Afghanistan would meet with similar failure. However, these military failures were not a result of poor doctrine, but rather terrible politics and a lack of unification amongst the population, which have historically been fragmented in both nations into tribalist camps. Despite their strategic failures, NATO proved it was a nimble force capable of responding to conflicts globally and, most important of all, keeping them well supplied over a long-term, multi-year war. In terms of hardware, both sides are pretty evenly matched thanks to NATO's 30-member list. The inclusion of Sweden and Finland will only boost available manpower, but right now NATO is capable of fielding an estimated 3.5 million soldiers versus Russia and China's 3.3 million. Russia's contribution using pre-Ukraine numbers. While some NATO members are still struggling to modernize their equipment and using Cold War hardware, NATO's most militarily important members such as France, the United States, Britain, Turkey, and Germany all field very modern armies. Russia has seen most of its modern stockpiles of equipment used up in Ukraine, forcing it to rely on older T-72s or even earlier tanks and infantry fighting vehicles lacking modern thermal or night vision sights. With an estimated 8,000 vehicles destroyed or lost in Ukraine, Russia enters this conflict at a significant disadvantage. Its aerospace forces are considerable, with the world's third-largest fighter fleet numbering at 772. However, once more, the war in Ukraine has shown significant deficiencies in Russia's ability to wage a modern air campaign, even against a foe with a much weaker air force. This is due to a lack of training and capabilities in neutralizing ground-based air defenses, leaving the Russian Air Force largely missing from the war in Ukraine. China fields a large fleet of over 600 Type 99A main battle tanks, with a similar number of Type 99s. The main component of this tank force, though, is the Type 96 tank, with over 2,500 in service. On paper, Chinese tanks are capable machines, but with no battlefield data to pull from, their true efficacy remains unknown. Modeled after Russian tanks, though, the Chinese tanks feature a carousel-style autoloader, which has proven to be a massive weakness when the tank is struck by modern anti-tank missiles. The Type 99 and Type 96 may end up giving Russian tanks a run for their money in the turret-tossing Olympics, and Beijing should be extremely alarmed at the performance of Russia's tanks in Ukraine. In the air, China has a very large air force with 1,200 fighters and interceptors. However, the Chinese Air Force suffers from a modernity problem, but it does field the world's second-largest fifth-generation flight with over 100 J-20s. Most of its air fleet could be considered capable, but its core of modern fourth-generation aircraft would be quickly attrited in air operations, leaving it with Cold War-era planes to try to face off against NATO's overwhelmingly modern air fleets. With roughly 2,500 Abrams, most of which are modern M1A2s, 1,500 Leopard 2s, and 800 various other models, NATO has the superior tank force when taking into account Russia's tank losses in Ukraine. Before the war, Russia claimed it had a tank fleet of 12,000. However, it was already known that most of these were very old Soviet models. As Russia has been forced to bring vehicles out of deep storage, though, it's been revealed that corruption has taken a significant toll on this vast stockpile of reserve equipment, with parts, pieces, and valuable components all stripped and sold off. Today, Russia would be lucky to be able to rush 1,000 tanks into service, and hoping that more than a token number of these would be capable of withstanding a fleet of modern American Abrams, British Challengers, or German Leopards would be a lost cause. With approximately 5,200 tanks, most of which are modern and capable, China could try to rival NATO's ground strength and support its Russian allies directly on a European battlefield. But here we get to the crux of the problem facing Russia and China in a war against NATO, and it comes down to one thing: logistics. As has been said, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. So, let's talk logistics. Russian logistics are famously terrible, with an inability to provide timely resupply far from the railroad hubs critical to its logistics networks. That's because Russian logistics is based entirely around trains, and then moving goods from trains to the front lines via trucks. As Russia has found out, though, railroad tracks are incredibly vulnerable to attack and sabotage, and as the front lines move further from railroad hubs, Russia's very limited logistics fleet has a difficult time moving supplies to frontline troops. That's because Russia operates an average 4 times fewer logistics personnel per battalion tactical group than an equivalently sized American force does. Once supply trucks become targeted, as Ukraine famously did north of Kyiv, that logistics disparity is further compounded, directly leading to the mass abandonment of multi-million-dollar vehicles by troops too starving to fight or simply out of ammo. You know you're not winning a war when you've become your enemy's biggest supplier of military hardware. Chinese logistics are better, but not by much. Famously, the People's Liberation Army and accompanying branches rely heavily on civilian logistics firms. As much as a third of its logistics, possibly even more, relies on civilian firms, and these are extremely unlikely to be survivable or even able to operate in a wartime environment. China relies on its massive industrial might to keep its military equipped, and that's great if you're fighting inside your own borders, but not so great when you're trying to invade an island nation or fight a major conflict with Russian allies in Europe. China's second biggest logistical problem is its over-reliance on railroads and roads. While both are economically effective ways to move people and goods, they are vulnerable in wartime and incapable of resupplying expeditionary forces outside of your own borders. With a very modest capability for maritime or airborne heavy lift operations, China would have to rely on moving forces to Europe via road and rail networks, which would become prime targets for long-range precision NATO weapons and special forces. And the further from China that its forces go, the worse its logistics become. Even with Russian help, there's simply no way the Chinese army could operate in Europe in significant numbers for very long. The disparity in logistics personnel between China and the US is similar to that of Russia, with an estimated 25% the number of logistics troops that the US fields, despite the US having a smaller military numerically. China may be perfectly suited for the logistical needs of its peacetime military, but incapable of tackling wartime logistics. For example, the United States maintains a ratio of 1:7 in terms of recovery vehicles versus armored vehicles, while China's numbers are 1:17. After calculating for maintenance and battlefield losses, China's recovery vehicle fleet would be incapable of keeping China's armored forces operational for very long. Further complicating its logistics is the fact that China has only in the last year created a joint logistical force, and that most of its senior commanders have never served in logistics billets, giving them zero experience when planning military operations and how to sustain them. Realistically, China and Russia only pose a threat to their immediate neighbors. Despite having the world's largest navy, China lags behind the US alone in total battle force missiles, with approximately only 50% the total battle force missile numbers of the US Navy. Further, it has a critical lack of fleet replenishment vessels, and only 2 aircraft carriers, making it impossible to support a war against NATO in Europe. For its part, Ukraine has proven more than a capable adversary for Russia, and Russia has quickly found itself going from the world's second strongest military to the second strongest military inside Ukraine. With its stockpiles of modern weapons running dangerously low, and an inability to quickly resupply, Russia would be utterly overwhelmed by NATO forces in the Western theater. Not to put too fine a point on it, but the Ukrainian war has proven that Russia is wholly incapable of facing off against NATO's European forces, let alone the United States and Canada joining the fray. Meanwhile, in the East, NATO would likely never even have to fire a shot at China in order to neutralize it, with most of its trade and, more importantly, its imports of gas and oil traveling through the Indian Ocean and the Malacca Straits. NATO fleets could simply blockade China and starve it into submission. A NATO-Sino-Russian war would end in overwhelming defeat for the Sino-Russian alliance if waged today, largely due to inexperience, bad doctrine, and geographical vulnerabilities. Now go check out NATO's World War III plan, or click this other video instead.